By now, most of the features and mechanics that serve as the foundation of these fighting games have been discussed. To some, a lot of this information isn't needed to get enjoyment out of Darkstalkers. Players can be satisfied simply choosing a character they like, mashing buttons to their heart's content, pulling off a special move every now and then until they defeat enough opponents to reach the final boss and end credits. And there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes all players want to do is turn on the game and have some spontaneous fun. However, only seeing the game with this minimal perspective usually means they barely scratch the surface of what Darkstalkers and games like it are capable of. Players who choose to dig deeper can discover a greater potential not just in the games, but in themselves that drives them to continually come back and keep playing the game against others for years to come. While it sounds simple enough just to say one wants to actually get good at the game, it's always been very difficult to find a solution that works for everyone. That's because there is no guaranteed successful plan anyone can follow when it comes to getting good at fighting games or playing at a so-called high level. It is something that can't be understood just by watching a single video, like this one, breaking down the game into a list of features and mechanics, and even at that pace, to someone new to fighting games, that's a lot of material to impose on them to completely comprehend. Then again, that's the harsh reality of fighting games. Before going on, it should be noted that a lot of the following information is taken directly from numerous articles and videos on how to learn fighting games produced by much more experienced teachers than myself, like Patrick Miller, Seth Killian, and James Chen. If you want further details on what is about to be discussed, be sure to check out some of the links to their work listed beneath this video in the description. Most fighting games designed to play at a high level tend to be incomprehensible to anyone but the designers who made it and enthusiasts of the genre. Compared to other video games, fighting games are a relatively niche genre, normally with small but loyal fan bases, and they don't reach near the audience they could because most people don't get the play experience these games are designed around, the arcades against a local player consuming one credit at a time. Many players unfamiliar with the genre can see fighting games as informational brick walls, where before they believe they can make any meaningful choices and informed decisions in a match, thinking through strategy and coming up with clever plays, they have to memorize dozens of moves like button combinations, what triggers them, and what they do. This could easily balloon into hundreds if one wants to understand all the characters on the roster. For most people, this is an impossible amount of information to learn, so they give up before ever getting to the real meat of the fighting game. And they're not entirely wrong either. Players who've been with a fighting game for months or years have learned a lot in their time, and still continue to get better. If a player is starting with a new fighting game for the first time, becoming anywhere near as good as an experienced player can often be a daunting task. Becoming intimidated while playing a new fighting game against another player, or even the computer, is an experience that everyone has had or will have when they are first starting a new fighting game. To get to a point where one can at least be decent with a fighting game, players have to commit to it, continually playing and not giving up. If that's something the player wants to commit their time to, the first likely question would be, where do you start? Do you read books or editorials written by fighting game experts? Do you watch matches between higher level players? Do you spend a lot of time in training mode? Again, there is no foolproof plan when it comes to getting good at a fighting game. There's a lot of information one will need to go over, so the best place to start is on your own. Jumping into training mode may seem goalless since there's no set goal for you to follow. Playing online against other players can get you beaten easily. Even playing against the computer can be a challenge because there's usually no reliable patterns the player can pick up. You may not be fortunate enough to play against another human player because there's no one around interested in playing a fighting game with you, let alone one as old as Darkstalkers. If these sound like your starting conditions, a good place to start practicing on your own is by viewing Darkstalkers as a one-player game. You should start by looking over the game's roster and choosing a character that you like. This sounds obvious, but if you like the character, even if it just comes down to their aesthetics, you're more likely to enjoy playing around with them, which makes it a lot easier to want to learn how to play the game at a higher level. When you're just starting out with a new character, one of the first things you should do is just get a feel for how the character behaves when you move them around and press the attack buttons. Instead of worrying about what each of their special moves do, just start by learning how to do normal attacks and choosing a couple favorite ones that look useful to you. Training mode is a great place for learning what moves work best for you and finding the ones you like and can always go to. When doing this, try to understand each move's advantages and trade-offs in order to find out which moves are good in different situations. Some moves cover the area above your character's head, so they're good for hitting enemies that jump at you. Moves that extend across the screen are good for keeping your enemy at range, and so on. Don't pay too much attention to how painful or flashy something looks. Often the coolest looking moves are the ones you want to use sparingly. fighting games are, at their most basic level, really fancy versions of rock, paper, scissors. You can think of your character's options in a fighting game in the same way you would in other video games, like platformers where you decide when to jump and attack, or action games where you decide where to swing or fire a weapon at an enemy. There are clear advantages to performing certain moves, but a dumb or poorly timed one could and will leave your character exposed and vulnerable. Any given character in Darkstalkers has dozens of different moves coming from 6 buttons, a few throws, special moves, and a couple supers. As such, the most useful thing a novice can do is simplify the game. If you learn to think of Darkstalkers as a series of predictable situations with optimal solutions, you can forget all the different dumb choices in any given situation and focus on executing the 1 or 2 good choices. Once you think you've gotten a good enough handle of your chosen character, the next thing to learn about is your environment. In other video games, your environment would normally be referring to a stage level that's littered with enemies or environmental hazards, but in fighting games like Darkstalkers, the environment you should be focusing on and watching constantly is your opponent. After familiarizing yourself with enough of your character's moves, you shouldn't have to watch them anymore and instead start getting used to fighting another character, which means focusing on what they are doing and reacting to them. Learning to react to your environment is something required in lots of video games revolving around one-player game experiences. You still control your character knowing what they are capable of, but with fighting games, it's not about the level being traversed by your character, but the other character that's in their way. Just like in other game experiences, as you react to your environment, you are learning to find patterns and anticipate, applying control from what you know. This is why it's best for new players to start using only the moves they know, like, or remember on the easiest difficulty, because the amount of knowledge expected from you is usually much smaller. Even though the computer isn't really challenging, it still gives you an opportunity to land combos in many types of situations, and not just a non-movable dummy. This is beneficial for the player because you will be able to change up the opponent's attack options, allowing you to get accustomed to certain situations. Obviously, the best type of training is playing against a human opponent because they are more strategic and skillful than computer opponents in fighting games. But there is a downfall to it too. If you play against a human player that is clearly out of your league, you won't learn anything. The only thing that will come from it is that you will lose and become discouraged. For an aspiring up-and-coming player, you should find someone that is on your skill level or near it and go from there. If you don't have anyone available to start with, that's where the computer opponent comes in handy. Finding a sparring partner or group is very important because you get more opportunities to think and strategize, while also possibly trading techniques or thoughts on particular matchups. Learn what you can learn. As you keep playing, you'll find out uses for moves and which ones work best or worst for you. Whether practicing in training mode or fighting against a computer opponent, you can more easily experiment with moves, finding favorites that work better for you in a given situation so you can add them to your base arsenal. Over time, you'll find yourself occasionally replacing the moves you have with new and better ones. Try using every move in various situations, knowing you have a move in your base arsenal you are confident in using, because the more nervous you are at attempting to land a move, the worse you will end up playing. Take what you learn and generate new comfort situations. You may end up picking bad habits from the beginning with so-called comfort moves, but the good thing about bad habits is that they are bad for a reason. You'll end up losing for continually using them. If you play worrying about what may end up being bad for you in the long run, you'll never pick up anything in the short run. If you start to notice that every time you do a certain move you get punished for it, you'll eventually start wondering if there is something better to do, resulting in you finding a different comfort move to use. Sometimes this is the only way you'll ever learn to get out of a bad habit and get better. Every move in the game has an advantage and a disadvantage, depending on the situation it's used in. That doesn't mean all moves are equally good. There are some moves that are pretty useless or highly situational, and part of learning a fighting game is figuring out which ones are which. There will be times where your comfort moves don't work, but you'll still have the right reactions to be able to recognize situations and know what you are going for. Player opponents have the same options as computer opponents, except they can be much harder. Once you have moves and situations you're comfortable with, you can concentrate on moves and situations you're not comfortable with. After you become familiar with both your character's and opponent's moves, you should always remember to have a reason for doing something. In other words, you should always act with intention when playing a fighting game. When high-level players play a fighting game, they're usually seen pressing a lot of buttons all the time. It's because they're almost always utilizing every option they have, whether it be moving back and forth for positioning, whiffing attacks to expose their opponent, and so on. These players pretty much always have a reason for doing everything they do though. When you press a button, know exactly what you're doing and why. If it works, you know you should keep doing it and when. If it doesn't work, you can more easily diagnose what went wrong. Lots of getting better at a fighting game is trial and error, but if you don't know what you're trying, and if or why it's failing, you won't have any idea how to improve. It's okay to be wrong about these things. You've simply found another thing that won't work. But unless you have a specific intended outcome every time you press a button, you'll never be right. When something is working for you, keep doing it. The onus is on your opponent to stop it, even if that opponent is also your best friend. If it's a casual match, go ahead and try helping your friend find ways around it if that's what it takes. But don't stop doing what works. Even if you have to do it several times in a row before someone figures it out, you don't do yourself or any of your practice partners any favors by holding back like that. One of the most important tools to have as a fighting game player is really good execution. If you land a clean hit on your opponent, you want to make sure it's going to count and you get closer to the win. Practicing your combos and executions helps a lot because it builds a type of muscle memory in your fingers so your body can understand when you need to do the combo and when you hit your opponent. Players need to know what it feels like to get a victory in a fighting game, when things go well for them in a match, as well as when things don't. If you're having trouble understanding what caused you to lose against your opponent, consider recording all of your matches, both wins and losses. Study them, and try to realize the faults in the matches. Think about what you could have done better. Practice against the technique that caused your loss. Run it back at the next opportunity you get. This also helps show some of the weaknesses your opponent has if you face that opponent again. After you've gotten used to the flow of the game, start trying to learn technical details. Instead of worrying about learning combos in the beginning, start small and worry about the more advanced moves later. When watching a match between high-level players, try putting yourself in the shoes of one of them, watching for things you wouldn't have done or never seen done. Experiencing what one player can do can let someone else learn it and demonstrate it on another opponent. Watch what they are doing and try doing it yourself. An important thing for someone new to fighting games or interested in getting into one is seeing what others do in this situation or what they do to get out of that situation. Once you've gotten a handle of how to learn the game, the next thing you should do is play against as many opponents as you can. Even if you dedicate the most time in training mode and can defeat everyone you know, you won't get better without people pushing you to improve. In order to get better, you need people who are capable of defeating you in different ways, which means that as you get better, you'll need to find new people to play with and find ways to make those you currently play against even better. The days of finding a local arcade featuring Darkstalkers, let alone a local group dedicated to it, have long passed. But with the rise of social media and online multiplayer, communities for older games have been given a second chance to grow. So if you want to expand your knowledge on the game, it's imperative for you to reach out to them. In 2013, Capcom released Darkstalkers Resurrection, a game compilation featuring Night Warriors and Vampire Savior. But long before then, there's been a growing community of players who've played the games online through other methods, like Fightcade and GGPO. These players have developed and shared more technical and in-depth strategies for each character in Darkstalkers through online sites like Mizuumi, Dustloop, and scheduled gatherings and meetups through social media sites like Facebook. While an original arcade machine is probably the best way to play these games, that's rarely a viable option for a lot of people outside Japan. Most console ports of Darkstalkers have been inferior or become obsolete over the years. Darkstalkers Resurrection is probably the most convenient option for console owners, as it also uses the same matchmaking options as those playing through PC emulation. Neither are perfect solutions for new players, as the community tends to be at a very high level given its long existence as an available platform. Still, that time has given the community a considerably larger base, resulting in more convenience when it comes to a player finding a new opponent. This larger base of players on PC has enabled better opportunities to coordinate online matches and even have tournaments on a regular basis for players to participate or simply spectate.
The what? Oh, there's actual lures for the characters on YouTube? I never even heard of that.
Yeah, I'll tell you about it. The retrospective, it's very, very good, very in-depth. And also, if you're ever interested in the characters, you got like the Nostalgic Gamer on YouTube. Yeah. That's the guy. Nostalgic Gamer. Okay. So what he does is that he does character bios, and he also does a 1-hour video on Darkstalkers, a retrospective. So he talks about the creators, their inspirations behind Darkstalkers, how really open world it is.
While this community may not draw the largest numbers in either the West or the East, the fact that they still continue to gather and compete in tournaments for a game as old as Darkstalkers should be proof enough of their dedication to the series and their willingness to accept and teach those who may also become interested. Something that remains prevalent in a lot of fighting games is the idea of the tier list, which is basically a character ranking devised by the community to understand who among the roster is superior to the others. There's nothing wrong with playing the characters you want to play with, but if you want to understand Darkstalkers at a reasonably competent level, you really should check a tier list to see who the community thinks is the best, the worst, and why. This isn't to say tier lists are objective statements of fact, because they're not. There are several fighting games where the highest tier characters have never won major tournaments. What they're good for is telling you what kind of assets you'll need to understand and deal with to be a competent player at this game. That doesn't mean you can't beat so-called high tier characters with lower tier characters, but rather you should consider practicing with these characters first to really know what you're dealing with. Maybe you'll find out that the supposed weaker characters you like to use have some of the same abilities as the top tier ones. Maybe you'll find out that you actually like playing with the top tier characters more. Whatever it is, you can't say you really know the game unless you know who is good and why. While there is an obvious separation in tiers, some characters will have an easier time winning than others. For instance, Vampire Savior, like any other fighting game, is unbalanced, but not exceptionally unbalanced. Proper utilization of the game's mechanics can take you a long way, and the characters themselves are designed dynamically enough to have a good number of movement, attack, or defensive options. Each character does have their bad matchups and their good matchups, but it is usually not skewed enough to promote hard counter picks. Most characters have a reasonable shot at being able to handle most matchups. Matchups aside, however, you should always pick the characters you're most comfortable with. Even if it may open you up to a slight mismatch, you want maximum execution, and playing with your character is the easiest way to make that happen. Don't rely on someone else's rankings to decide your teams for you. Playing your character also vastly decreases the chances of being paralyzed when you're put into an unfamiliar situation, something that top players are good at doing to you. You don't want to have to stop and think about what technique is going to get you out of this one. You want to know reflexively and automatically. The hesitation that anyone else brings on you will cost you. To maintain mental toughness, you want to stay fresh, be in the moment, and stick with what you know. Focus on your match and you can hold on to the motivation required to win. Between PCs and consoles, we've got many different ways to find some real human competition without leaving home. Unfortunately, fighting games are pretty much universally affected by lag to such a degree that you won't be able to recreate competition conditions while playing online. Since we're dealing with games that can often come down to individual frames and adding lag on top of that, playing online is a great way to build your matchup experience, especially if you don't live in an area where you have easy access to other people who play every other character in the game. However, you have to keep in mind that it's really easy to develop bad habits by playing online too much. Certain moves and setups that worked online may not in local multiplayer where lag is less of a factor. So play online if you want, but try to get in some local matches in person if you can, so it won't be too hard for your muscle memory to constantly switch between the two. Compared to Night Warriors, Vampire Savior is considered to be the faster-paced fighting game that features a stronger focus on momentum. Either game's cast is extremely diverse and charismatic, with many of them having completely different fighting styles and movement options. That being said, anyone in the Vampire Savior cast has a decent chance of winning just about any matchup. Its pacing is fast and considered one of a kind, with the focus not being on the combo, but what the player does to get that hit. Vampire Savior is easy to pick up and play due to how combos are downplayed, but a lot will be expected of the player in order to master the speed and requirements that go along with it. Almost every normal attack for every character was designed to be useful, and you'll be thinking often when it's best to use each one. While the basic combos are easy, all characters were designed to have an extra bit of flair if you want to put in the effort, though the skills needed to master those things can be steep. What someone finds appealing about Vampire Savior can differ from person to person, but it seems to take the best with those who can admire extreme pace while retaining strong fundamentals, and those with a high appreciation for the characters and setting. For those picking up the game for fun, like what was said previously, it really is easy to pick up and start playing. The lack of difficult or long combos, and just being able to do basic ground chains into knockdown, makes things easy to get started. You don't really need to put in a lot of time into training mode, outside of a few specific things for each character. Many players, even high-level ones, have not put in more than a couple hours into training mode. Playing a high-level player in Vampire Savior can feel brutal, and it can take a bit of time to adjust to the pacing of the game. Having a thick skin and some motivation will take you a long way. Many players aiming to become good become discouraged, but the difficulty to master Savior is said to breed remarkably strong players, and once you get to that level, often other games will feel like they are moving in slow motion. This should be enough information for one to get started on getting good at Darkstalkers, but with so much time and commitment required to the game in order to reach that next level, surely a novice can't help but question its purpose in the long run. Why would someone want to dedicate so much time into a fighting game when they could easily find satisfaction from playing one of many other genres of video games? It's probably something best explained by more seasoned players, but the truth is that becoming exceptional at a fighting game is, for many, an experience incomparable and unobtainable to anything else. That's part of the reason why there are so many people who continue to play these games together long after their releases without substantial prizes or recognition on the line. Fighting games are highly physical endeavors. In many cases, your success or failure depends on your ability to see something coming and perform a rather complicated move with utmost accuracy down to fractions of a second. For example, the difference between throwing a fireball and performing a dragon punch is entirely based on when you press the punch button. It's easy to get one when you want it the other if you are not clean and intentional with all your inputs. Playing a fighting game means you're studying a game down to individual pixels, animation frames, processor cycles, and its player, meaning your opponent, down to behavioral patterns, tics, and state of mind, all in order to make the game as miserable as possible for the other person. In rather broad strokes, fighting games are about imposing your will on your opponent. Your goal is to make a series of intelligent situations using the tools the designers have given you to constrict your opponent's options, forcing them to make ever more dangerous gambles until they do something you can punish them for. You want to put your opponent in these situations over and over until they lose, and then you put them in these situations again and again until they don't want to play with you anymore. There's something deeply satisfying about seeing these games played truly well. It has a kind of beauty all its own. A well-played match has a flow like nothing else that you'll never see just screwing around, no matter how big the combos or how wacky the tactics. Of course, this doesn't mean high-level players aren't having fun. Most every top player has a ton of fun playing these games. These people are playing the game better, more satisfyingly, seeing more in it, all while getting to beat everyone down at the same time. At high-level play, it isn't about reflexes but strategy, positioning the player and opponent like in a chess game. This is part of why enthusiasts are so enamored with the fighting game genre. Learning to beat another person in a fighting game involves understanding elements of game design, psychology, programming and basic machine input and output, human physiology, motivation, and several other serious bodies of human knowledge, and then applying them to go beat down your opponent's virtual avatar. You must train yourself to understand complicated situations and react to them with complicated physical movements within fractions of a second. Perhaps most importantly, you must learn how to get better at something, how to absorb good behaviors and discard bad ones, how to push yourself, how to practice, how to diagnose problems and fix them, and at the end of the day, these are the kinds of essential traits anyone should have in their life. 私を称